My husband scrolled his phone during my life-threatening IVF treatments until the doctor said, "If this lady was my wife, I'd kill to hold her hand." He completely snapped. My husband begged me to do IVF for 2 years because his mother wouldn't stop asking when she'd get grandchildren, and I finally gave in even though needles make me pass out. 3 days into my egg retrieval cycle, my stomach swelled up like I was already 9 months pregnant because of a negative reaction where fluid filled my belly, and they had to admit me to the hospital. The second they got me into a room, my husband set up his laptop on the visitor's table and said he might as well catch up on work while we waited. I lay there with tubes in my arms and my stomach so swollen I couldn't breathe right, while he sat 5 feet away clicking through his fantasy football lineups and groaning about point projections. Every time a nurse came to drain more fluid from my belly with a huge needle, he'd turn his screen away like they might see his paycheck. "Your meal is getting cold," said a voice coming in. I looked up to see Dr. House walking in with my chart, the same doctor who'd been treating me since this nightmare started 4 days ago. He was in his mid-40s with salt and pepper hair and always looked me right in the eye when he talked. "The cafeteria actually made chicken soup today, but you haven't touched it." He looked at me struggling to sit up enough to reach the tray table. "Here, let me adjust your bed so you can actually eat something." He pressed the button to raise me up slowly, and I almost cried because my husband hadn't even noticed I'd been lying flat for 3 hours, unable to reach anything. "Speaking of your husband," Dr. House said while checking my IV bag, "he asked the nurses earlier if the TV in here could get ESPN because it's apparently draft season." My mouth fell open. "He asked them that while I'm here like this?" Dr. House looked uncomfortable for a second, then seemed to make a decision. "He also stopped by to complain about the parking garage rates while you were getting your paracentesis done." The words hit like punches because a paracentesis is when they stick a needle in your swollen belly to drain the fluid, and I'd been terrified and alone while he was arguing about $8 parking. I thought about how he'd missed my trigger shot 2 nights ago because his draft was at the same time, and I had to inject myself in the hospital bathroom. The tears started before I could stop them, and it was probably the hormones making everything worse, but it still hurt. Dr. House immediately grabbed tissues and actually wiped my face himself because my hands were too swollen to bend right, and that simple gesture made me realize nobody had touched me gently in weeks. "I shouldn't have said that," he started. "No, you're just telling me what happened," I said. "He hasn't been to a single injection class either." Dr. House sat on the edge of my bed, and his face showed something between professional concern and personal frustration. "When my wife did IVF, I gave her every single shot myself because her hands shook too bad." From across the room, my husband's phone suddenly played a loud draft alert sound that made me flinch because it sounded like my medication alarm, and he had the nerve to mutter, "It's not that loud," when I winced. Dr. House stood up and moved closer to check my IV, but really he was putting himself between us. "You know what gets me about this job?" He adjusted my blanket and kept talking. "Sometimes I watch men sit there while their wives go through hell to have their babies, and I think if this lady was my wife, risking ovarian torsion and kidney problems for my child, I'd kill to hold her hand through this, not draft wide receivers while she suffers." He paused. "But maybe I'm old-fashioned about marriage and supporting your partner through medical trauma." My husband looked up and slammed his laptop shut so hard the table shook. He jumped up from his chair. "What the hell did you just say to me?" "I was discussing my observations about patient support systems," Dr. House said calmly. "But if something I said bothered you, maybe you should ask yourself why." My husband suddenly grabbed my swollen hand, squeezing too hard. "I've been supporting her this whole time, and I want a different doctor right now." Dr. House looked him straight in the eye. "Quick question then, since you've been so involved. What's her current estradiol level?" My husband stared straight at him with his jaw clenched, knowing damn well he didn't know what estradiol meant despite being told 67 times. After Dr. House left to continue rounds, my husband said, "That doctor needs to be reported for being unprofessional." I stared at him. "What medications am I on?" He rolled his eyes. "What kind of question is that?" "Obviously you're on." He stopped. His hand actually started reaching for his phone like the answer might be in his texts. After minutes of painful silence, Dr. House came back in. "I have some news." He turned to my husband. "But you need to leave before I can give it." My husband shot up and grabbed the tray of food off the table. He moved toward the door, but Dr. House stepped directly into his path and held up one hand. The doctor's voice stayed calm but firm when he said the medical update couldn't wait any longer because my condition required immediate decisions. My husband stopped with the tray still in his hands, and his face showed this mix of anger and confusion, like he couldn't believe someone was actually blocking him from leaving. I pressed back against the raised hospital bed and felt my swollen stomach push against the thin blanket, too tired to play peacemaker between them anymore. Dr. House gestured for my husband to put the tray down and take a seat because what he needed to explain was serious. The tray clattered back onto the table and my husband stayed standing with his arms crossed tight across his chest. The doctor pulled my chart closer and started explaining that my estradiol levels had climbed to a dangerous point overnight, way higher than they'd expected, and my body was showing severe OHSS symptoms that could get worse fast. He said the safest thing to do was cancel this IVF cycle completely to protect my health, and the words landed like someone had punched me in the chest, even though part of me knew he was right. All those shots and appointments and money and pain, just gone. My husband's face went bright red and he demanded to know why nobody had told him it was this serious before now. Dr. House responded in that same even tone that he'd been trying to discuss my condition multiple times, but my husband had been focused on parking garage rates and fantasy football drafts instead of medical updates. The room went quiet except for the beeping of my IV machine. My husband opened his mouth and closed it again, and I watched him try to think of something to say that would make him look better. Dr. House didn't wait for a response before he started outlining what happened next. He said I needed continued fluid monitoring for at least another day, strict discharge criteria that had to be met before I could go home, and a detailed home care plan that required actual partner involvement, not someone sitting across the room on a laptop. He listed off tasks like helping me to the bathroom, preparing meals I could actually eat, watching for warning signs like sudden weight gain or trouble breathing. My husband grabbed the tray again and set it down hard enough that the soup bowl rattled, then said he needed to make some calls. He walked out without looking at me once, and I heard his footsteps getting quieter down the hallway. Once we were alone, Dr. House pulled the visitor chair closer to my bed and sat down with a tired sigh. He asked if I had family or friends who could help me at home during recovery. I thought about my sister who lived 2 hours away with 3 kids under 5, and my best friend who just had a baby and was drowning in her own stuff. The truth hit me that I'd spent so much time focused on getting pregnant that I'd let my whole support system shrink down to almost nothing. I told him my sister might be able to come for a day or two, but she had her hands full and my best friend was on maternity leave dealing with a newborn. Dr. House nodded like he'd heard similar stories before and started explaining what OHSS recovery actually required. Someone needed to monitor my symptoms every few hours, help me get to the bathroom, because standing up too fast could make me dizzy, prepare soft foods that wouldn't upset my stomach, and watch for warning signs like my ankles swelling more or my breathing getting harder. He said I'd need help changing positions in bed because my stomach was so swollen that rolling over hurt, and someone should check my weight daily because sudden gains meant fluid was building up again. The list kept going, and it became super clear that my husband scrolling through fantasy football projections 5 feet away wasn't going to cut it at all. I felt this wave of exhaustion wash over me that had nothing to do with the OHSS and everything to do with realizing how alone I actually was in this. I asked Dr. House what the medical news was that he'd needed to tell me privately, the thing that made him kick my husband out. He leaned forward with his elbows on his knees and explained that beyond the high estradiol levels, I was at serious risk for blood clots forming in my legs or lungs because of how the hormones were affecting my blood. He said I also had early signs of kidney problems from the fluid imbalance. Nothing permanent yet, but something that needed close watching. The treatment plan included injecting blood thinners at home every day for at least 2 weeks, maybe longer depending on how my body responded. My hands started shaking just thinking about giving myself shots while recovering from this nightmare, especially since I'd told everyone from the start that needles made me pass out. Dr. House must have seen my face go pale because he quickly added that the hospital could arrange for a home health nurse to come teach me the injection technique and check on me for the first few days. He said the nurse would make sure I knew what to do and would watch for any complications that needed immediate attention. I felt pathetic needing a complete stranger to do what my husband should be doing, but I also felt this huge sense of relief that someone would actually help me. The nurse would know what to look for and wouldn't be distracted by draft pics or work emails. My husband came back into the room about 20 minutes later and announced that he'd talked to his boss about taking a few days off work. He said it like he was doing me this massive favor, like he deserved a medal for basic human decency. I noticed right away that he said a few days, not however long she needs, or until she's better. Just a few days, like my recovery had a firm deadline that fit his schedule. Dr. House stood up from the visitor chair and turned to face my husband directly. He asked in a very clear voice if my husband could commit to learning the injection technique for the blood thinners, following the medication schedule without missing doses and driving me to all the follow-up appointments over the next few weeks. My husband shifted his weight from one foot to the other and said obviously he could do that, but his voice had this defensive edge that made it sound like he was annoyed at being questioned. Dr. House's expression showed he wasn't convinced either, and neither was I, honestly. The doctor pulled out a printed sheet and started going over the medication schedule, pointing to each time slot and explaining what each drug did. My husband glanced at his phone twice while Dr. House was talking, and I saw the doctor's jaw tighten, but he kept going through the list. He emphasized that missing even one dose of the blood thinner could put me at risk for clots, and that the follow-up appointments weren't optional suggestions. My husband nodded along, but I could tell he wasn't really absorbing any of it, just waiting for the lecture to end so he could get back to whatever was on his phone. He slammed it back down and walked out without another word, and the door swung shut behind him with a soft click that somehow felt louder than if he'd slammed it. Dr. House waited a few seconds, probably making sure my husband wasn't coming back, then pulled the visitor chair closer to my bed and sat down. He said my kidney function test from this morning showed some problems, nothing that would need dialysis or anything that serious, but my kidneys were struggling because of all the fluid buildup and the stress my body was under. The treatment meant I'd need to inject blood thinners every single day for at least 2 weeks, maybe longer if my levels didn't improve fast enough. My hands started shaking just thinking about sticking needles in myself while trying to recover from this whole mess, especially since I'd told everyone a million times that needles made me pass out. Dr. House must have seen my face go white because he quickly said the hospital could set up a home health nurse to come teach me how to do the injections and check on me for the first few days. The nurse would know what warning signs to watch for and could call the doctor right away if anything looked wrong. I felt kind of pathetic needing a total stranger to help me with something my husband should be doing. But I also felt this huge wave of relief wash over me, knowing someone would actually be there who knew what they were doing. About 20 minutes later, my husband came back in and said he'd talked to his boss about taking a few days off work. He said it like he expected me to thank him or something. Like he deserved a medal for doing the absolute bare minimum a spouse should do. I noticed right away he said a few days, not however long you need or until you're better. Just a few days like my recovery had some kind of deadline that fit into his work schedule. Dr. House stood up and turned to face him directly, and his voice was very calm, but also very firm, when he asked if my husband could commit to learning how to give me the blood thinner shots, following all the medication schedules without missing any doses, and driving me to every single follow-up appointment over the next few weeks. My husband shifted his weight back and forth and said obviously he could do all that, but his voice had this annoyed edge to it like he was mad at being questioned about whether he'd actually help his own wife. Dr. House pulled out a printed paper and started going through the medication list, pointing at each time slot and explaining what each drug did and why it mattered. My husband glanced at his phone twice while the doctor was talking, and I saw Dr. House's jaw get tight, but he kept going through everything on the list. He really emphasized that missing even one dose of the blood thinner could put me at serious risk for clots, and that the follow-up appointments weren't just suggestions, they were required. My husband nodded along, but I could tell he wasn't really listening to any of it, just waiting for the lecture to end so he could get back to whatever was on his phone. Less than an hour after Dr. House left, a woman walked in carrying a clipboard and introduced herself as the social worker assigned to my case. She was probably in her 40s with her hair pulled back in a tight bun, and she had this very business-like way of talking that made it clear she wasn't here to make friends or sugarcoat anything. She sat down and started asking questions about our discharge plan, like who would be home with me during the day and whether we had family nearby who could help out. Then she turned to my husband and asked him to explain what OHSS was and what symptoms he should be watching for once we got home. He started talking but kept stumbling over his words, saying something about fluid and swelling, but getting the details all mixed up in a way that made it super obvious he hadn't been paying attention during any of the doctor's explanations. The social worker wrote something on her clipboard, and I couldn't see what it was, but I had a feeling it wasn't good. She looked at me next and asked in this very direct way if I felt safe going home with the current level of support I had. The question caught me totally off guard because I hadn't really thought about it in terms of being safe or not safe, more just in terms of being lonely and disappointed and scared. I opened my mouth to answer, but nothing came out at first because I was trying to figure out what the right answer even was. Finally, I admitted that I was really worried about trying to manage everything by myself while my husband was at work, and the social worker nodded like she'd heard this exact same thing from other women 100 times before. She said we should schedule a home health nurse to visit the day after I got discharged and probably a few more visits after that depending on how my recovery was going. The nurse could teach me the injection technique and check my vital signs, and make sure I wasn't developing any complications that needed immediate medical attention. My husband jumped in right away and said that home health visits were really expensive and probably wouldn't be covered by our insurance plan. The social worker didn't even blink, just explained in this very matter-of-fact voice that for high-risk OHSS recovery cases like mine, insurance companies almost always covered at least one home visit, and sometimes more if the doctor said it was medically necessary. She said she'd submit the paperwork for authorization today, and we should hear back within 24 hours. But based on my medical chart, she was confident it would get approved. My husband's face got all tight like he wanted to argue more, but couldn't think of a good reason to keep pushing back. The social worker made some more notes on her clipboard, and then handed me a packet of information about support resources for people going through fertility treatment, including phone numbers for counseling services and a list of online support groups. She said a lot of women found it helpful to connect with others who understood what they were going through, and that there was no shame in asking for help during such a physically and emotionally difficult time. After she left, my husband went back to his laptop and I just lay there staring at the ceiling, feeling more alone than I'd felt in my entire life, even though he was sitting right there 5 feet away from me. That night, after the nurses finished their evening rounds and my husband finally went home to sleep in our actual bed, I lay in the dark hospital room listening to the machines beep their steady rhythm. I kept thinking about how I'd ended up here, not just the medical crisis part, but the whole bigger picture of doing IVF for someone who couldn't even get off his phone during the worst thing that had ever happened to my body. His mother's voice kept playing in my head. All those comments over the past 2 years about when she'd finally get to be a grandmother, and how my husband would just sit there and let her pressure us instead of telling her to back off. I thought about the trigger shot I'd had to give myself in a hospital bathroom, because his fantasy draft was more important than being there for me. I thought about him complaining about parking costs while they were draining fluid from my belly with a huge needle. The machines kept beeping, and somewhere down the hall, a patient's call button went off and got answered. And I made a decision right then that I wasn't going through any of this again unless things changed in a real and basic way. Not just him saying sorry or promising to do better, but actual concrete changes in how he showed up and supported me. I didn't know yet what those changes would need to look like exactly, but I knew I couldn't keep doing this alone while pretending I had a partner. The next morning, the social worker came back with a stack of papers for me to sign giving permission for the home health visits. She'd also printed out some extra information about online support groups, specifically for women dealing with IVF complications, and she'd highlighted a few that had the most active communities. She said sometimes it helped to talk to people who really understood what you were going through, instead of trying to explain everything to family and friends who'd never been there. I signed all the forms with my still swollen hands, and thanked her for actually caring about what happened to me after I left the hospital. She smiled for the first time since I'd met her and said that was literally her job, but she could tell I needed to hear it anyway. Around mid-morning, Dr. Ed House came by doing his rounds and checked my chart before looking at me. He said my fluid levels were finally improving enough that I could probably go home tomorrow if today's blood work came back looking stable. He turned to my husband, who'd shown up about an hour earlier, and reminded him that he needed to pick up all my prescriptions today, so everything would be ready when we got home. Then he actually took out a pen and wrote down the pharmacy name and the full medication list on a piece of paper, which he handed directly to my husband, like he was a kid who needed written instructions to remember his homework. My husband took the paper and pulled out his phone right away, and for the first time since this whole nightmare started, I watched him actually use it for something helpful. He was setting reminders for when to pick up the prescriptions and what time the pharmacy closed and typing notes about which medications were which. It was such a tiny thing, but I noticed it anyway because it was the first time I'd seen him take initiative about any part of my medical care without someone having to force him. The next morning came way too fast, and suddenly there were nurses everywhere helping me get dressed and unhooking all my IVs and going over discharge instructions. One nurse in particular, an older woman with gray streaks in her dark hair, went over the medication schedule with my husband 3 separate times. She made him repeat back the timing and the doses for each drug until he got everything exactly right, and she didn't move on to the next medication until she was satisfied he actually understood. She also gave him a printed schedule with everything color-coded and told him to post it somewhere we'd both see it every day, like on the bathroom mirror or the refrigerator. The whole discharge process took forever with all the paperwork and the final check of my vital signs, and the nurse going over warning signs one more time. By the time we finally got to leave, it was almost noon, and I was exhausted from just sitting there. The ride home felt like it took hours, even though our house was only about 20 minutes from the hospital. My husband drove super carefully, slowing down for every single bump in the road while I held a pillow pressed against my still swollen stomach. The pillow helped a little bit, but every tiny jolt still hurt, and I had to keep shifting positions trying to find a way to sit that didn't make the pain worse. He asked once if I was okay, and I said yes even though I definitely wasn't, because I just didn't have the energy for a real conversation about how scared and hurt and angry I felt. We drove the rest of the way in silence with the radio off, and I watched the familiar streets go by thinking about how different everything looked now compared to 3 weeks ago, when we'd driven to the fertility clinic full of hope and excitement about starting this process. When we pulled into the driveway, I unbuckled my seatbelt slowly, because even that small movement made my swollen belly ache. My husband came around to my side and opened the door, then stood there looking at me like he wasn't sure how to help. I pushed myself forward in the seat, and he finally reached out to take my arm, supporting my weight as I stood up and shuffled toward the house. Each step hurt, and I had to stop twice just to catch my breath before we made it to the front door. Inside, he guided me straight to the bedroom and pulled back the covers while I lowered myself onto the edge of the mattress. Getting my legs up onto the bed took forever, and he had to lift my feet for me because bending that much sent sharp pains through my middle. He stood next to the bed after I was settled and shifted his weight from one foot to the other. I asked for water and some crackers if we had any. He nodded and left quickly, coming back 3 minutes later with a full glass and a sleeve of saltines on a small plate. He set them on my nightstand within reach, and I thanked him, noticing how this felt like progress even though bringing your sick wife water was basically nothing. The home health nurse knocked on our door at 9 the next morning. My husband answered and brought her back to the bedroom where I was still lying flat because sitting up took too much energy. She introduced herself and immediately started checking how I was breathing, watching my chest rise and fall and asking if I felt short of breath. She had gray streaks in her dark hair and moved with the kind of confidence that made me feel safer just having her there. She pulled back my blanket and lifted my shirt to look at the small incision sites where they'd drained the fluid, pressing gently around each one and asking if anything felt hot or more tender than yesterday. Then came the questions about my pain levels on a scale of 1 to 10, how many times I'd gotten up to use the bathroom, whether I'd noticed any new swelling in my legs or feet. I answered everything while my husband stood in the doorway listening, and I could tell from his face that he was realizing how much he didn't know about what was happening with my body. The nurse pulled supplies from her bag and set them on the dresser. She explained that I needed blood thinner shots every day for at least 2 weeks to prevent clots, and she'd be teaching my husband how to give them. She called him over and made him wash his hands at the bathroom sink before she'd let him touch anything. From the bag, she took out an orange and a practice syringe, showing him how to hold it at the right angle and push the needle through the thick skin. He fumbled with it at first, his hands shaking slightly as he tried to copy her movements. She made him do it 5 times on the orange until he got the technique smooth. Then she had him draw up saline from a vial and practice the full motion. When he finally did it right, she nodded and said, "Now they'd try it on me." I pulled up my shirt to expose my stomach, and the nurse showed him where to pinch the skin and insert the needle at a 45-degree angle. His face showed actual worry as he brought the needle close to my skin, and when he pushed it in and injected the medicine, he immediately asked if I was okay. It was the first time in days I'd seen real concern on his face instead of annoyance or distraction. After the injection, the nurse walked through our bedroom looking at the nightstand and dresser. She asked where we were keeping track of my medication schedule, and my husband admitted we didn't have anything written down. The nurse shook her head and pulled a small whiteboard from her bag, the kind with a marker attached by a string. She drew a grid on it with the days of the week across the top, and all my medications down the side, filling in the times for each dose. She hung it on the wall next to the bed where we could both see it clearly. Then she turned to my husband and told him his job was to check off each medication after I took it and watch for any of the warning signs on the list she was leaving. She pulled out a printed sheet with symptoms like sudden weight gain, severe belly pain, trouble breathing, and decreased urination. She made him read through the whole list out loud to make sure he understood what to watch for. After she packed up her supplies and left, my husband sat on the edge of the bed staring at the whiteboard. He said that seeing everything written out like that made him realize how much he hadn't understood about what I was going through. It wasn't exactly an apology, and he didn't say he was sorry for being absent, but it was the closest he'd come to admitting he'd failed to show up for me. I didn't say anything back because I was too tired to get into it, and part of me wanted to see if he'd actually follow through with the checklist before I gave him credit for noticing. That afternoon, he left to pick up groceries and refill one of my prescriptions. As soon as I heard his car pull out of the driveway, I reached for my phone on the nightstand. The social worker had given me a packet of resources and I'd stuck it in the drawer, so I pulled it out and found the page about online support groups. There were 3 different groups listed for people going through IVF, and I picked the one that had the most members. I typed the name into my browser and requested to join, then scrolled through the posts while I waited for approval. Reading through other women's stories made something loosen in my chest because so many of them were dealing with the same things. Partners who didn't understand the medication schedules, family members who asked insensitive questions about timelines, the physical pain and emotional exhaustion of the whole process. Within 10 minutes, I got the notification that I'd been approved to join the group. I made my first post keeping it short and simple. I explained that I was recovering from severe OHSS and had to cancel my first IVF cycle, and that I was feeling pretty alone in the whole thing. I hit post and set my phone down, not expecting much. But when I checked again an hour later, there were already 12 comments. Women saying they were sorry I was going through this, sharing their own OHSS stories, offering advice about recovery. One comment stood out from a woman whose username was Maggie K 2019. She said she'd been through almost the exact same thing and would be happy to talk more if I wanted to message her privately. I clicked on her profile and sent her a direct message thanking her for reaching out. She responded within minutes and we started messaging back and forth. She told me about her OHSS experience 3 years ago and how scary it had been when her stomach swelled up and she couldn't breathe right. She'd ended up in the hospital for 5 days and they had to cancel that cycle completely. The worst part, she said, was that her husband hadn't really understood how serious it was until she was actually hospitalized. But then she said something that surprised me. She explained that they'd had to pause treatment for 6 months while she recovered, and during that time they'd started couples therapy. She said the break ended up saving their marriage because it forced them to actually deal with their communication problems instead of just pushing through to the next cycle. By the time they tried IVF again, they were in a completely different place as a couple. She said her husband attended every single appointment the second time and learned all the medication names and gave her every injection himself. When my husband got home with the groceries, I heard him unpacking things in the kitchen. I waited until he came back to check on me. Then I told him I'd been thinking we should try couples therapy before we consider doing another IVF cycle. He stopped in the doorway and his eyebrows went up like he hadn't expected me to say that. He asked why I thought we needed therapy. I explained that the first cycle showed we had serious problems with communication and support, and I wasn't going through that again without making real changes first. He stood there quiet for a long moment, and I prepared myself for him to argue or dismiss the idea. But instead he said he'd think about it, which wasn't a yes but also wasn't an immediate no. I decided to take that as a small opening. Over the next few days, I started feeling stronger bit by bit. The swelling in my stomach went down gradually until I could actually see my feet again when I looked down. My husband gave me the blood thinner shot every evening, and while his hands still shook a little, he was getting better at the technique. Each time after he pulled the needle out, he asked if I was okay, and I noticed he was actually waiting for my answer instead of just asking out of obligation. He checked off the medications on the whiteboard without me having to remind him, and twice he caught mistakes where I almost took the wrong dose at the wrong time. These were tiny things that shouldn't have felt like big accomplishments, but after everything that happened in the hospital, I noticed every single one of them. On the 4th day of my recovery, I was lying in bed checking the medication whiteboard when my husband's phone rang in the kitchen. I heard him answer, and then his voice got quieter like he was moving away from the doorway. When he came back a few minutes later, he sat on the edge of the bed and told me his mother had called asking how I was doing and when we could come visit. He said he told her now wasn't a good time and he'd call her back later, which shocked me because in 5 years of marriage, I'd never heard him put her off like that. He looked uncomfortable and said he wasn't ready to deal with her questions about grandchildren yet, and his hands were fidgeting with his phone case the whole time he talked. I sat up slowly, still careful with my healing stomach, and told him that when he did talk to her, he needed to set a clear boundary, that our fertility treatment and timeline were private medical decisions between us and our doctors. He nodded slowly, and his eyes stayed on the floor, while he said he knew she'd been putting too much pressure on us, especially on him. The words came out quiet like he was admitting something he'd been avoiding for years. Later that afternoon, while my husband was giving me my blood thinner shot, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. I answered and heard a woman introduce herself as someone from our insurance company calling about the canceled IVF cycle. My stomach dropped because I'd been dreading this conversation about how much money we'd lost. She explained that we'd get partial reimbursement for the medications and monitoring appointments since the cycle was canceled for medical reasons. And I felt tears of relief starting because it didn't erase the financial hit, but it helped reduce the sting of feeling like we'd wasted all that money. After I hung up, I told my husband the news, and he actually looked relieved too, instead of immediately calculating numbers. The next morning, I woke up to find my husband at the kitchen table with his laptop open and a notepad covered in his handwriting. He saw me shuffle in and turned the screen toward me to show a list of couples therapists who specialized in fertility issues. He'd already called 3 of them and found one who had an opening in 2 weeks, and he'd made the appointment without me having to remind him or push him to do it. He forwarded me the confirmation email right there, so I had all the details, and I stared at my phone feeling something shift, because this was the kind of initiative I'd needed to see from him all along. That same day, Maggie sent me a long message with links to articles about setting boundaries with family members around fertility treatment. She explained how she and her husband had created a script for handling intrusive questions from relatives, and she offered to send me their template if I wanted to adapt it for our situation. I read through everything she sent, and then messaged back asking for the template, and within minutes she'd sent it along with notes about which parts had worked best for them. Over the next few days, Maggie and I kept messaging back and forth daily, and having someone who really understood what I'd been through made the recovery feel less lonely. My follow-up video appointment with Dr. House happened on day 8 of my recovery, and I set up my laptop on the kitchen table with my husband sitting next to me. Dr. House's face appeared on screen and he smiled when he saw me looking stronger, then asked specific questions about my symptoms and checked the numbers from my recent blood work. He said he was pleased with how my recovery was going, and my body was healing well from the OHSS. Then he asked about my support situation at home, and I glanced at my husband before telling Dr. House honestly that it had gotten better. I explained we were starting couples therapy in a week, and my husband had been more involved with my care, and Dr. House nodded like he was glad to hear it. His expression changed slightly, and he said he needed to mention something, then told me he'd received a formal complaint from my husband about their interaction in the hospital. My face got hot with embarrassment, but Dr. House kept talking calmly, explaining that he'd responded with documentation of the medical situation and his clinical reasoning for his patient advocacy. He said the hospital administration had reviewed everything and closed the matter, determining his actions were appropriate given the circumstances. I felt awful that my husband had actually gone through with filing that complaint, and I started to apologize, but Dr. House stopped me. He said patient safety always came first, and he'd make the same call again if he had to, and his voice was firm when he said it. Then his tone softened, and he mentioned that if I'd prefer to work with a different doctor for any future fertility treatment, he could recommend an excellent colleague who specialized in high-risk IVF cases. I sat there thinking about his offer while my husband shifted uncomfortably next to me, and I realized that while I was grateful for how Dr. House had advocated for me, it might actually be healthier to start fresh with a new doctor, who didn't have this whole history with my husband. I asked for the colleague's name, and Dr. House didn't look offended at all, just pulled up the contact information and sent it through the patient portal right away. He said he'd send over all my medical records and a detailed referral note so the transition would be smooth, and I thanked him for everything he'd done for me. After the appointment ended and I closed the laptop, my husband and I sat in silence for a minute before he said he knew the complaint had been stupid, and he'd filed it because he was embarrassed. The week leading up to our first therapy appointment crawled by with both of us getting more nervous, and the morning of the session we barely talked during the drive to the therapist's office. The waiting room had comfortable chairs and calming artwork, but I felt anything but calm sitting there with my hands clenched in my lap. When the therapist called us in, we walked into her office and sat on opposite ends of a couch, both of us stiff and avoiding eye contact. The therapist was a woman in her 60s with kind eyes and gray hair pulled back, and she sat across from us in an armchair with a notepad. She introduced herself and explained how these sessions would work, then asked us each to describe what brought us here today. I expected to have to go first like I always did with everything, but my husband cleared his throat and started talking before I could. He looked down at his hands and started rubbing his palms together like he was trying to warm them up. His voice came out quiet when he finally spoke, saying he knew he'd been awful during the whole IVF thing, and he didn't have a good excuse for it. The therapist leaned forward slightly and asked him to say more about that, and he took a deep breath before continuing. He admitted that every time I had an appointment or needed a shot, he felt this huge wave of helplessness wash over him, because there was nothing he could actually do to make the process easier. He said watching me go through all the needles and side effects made him feel useless, and instead of dealing with those feelings, he just checked out completely. I sat there listening, and part of me wanted to interrupt and say that checking out made everything 10 times worse, but I forced myself to stay quiet. He kept going and mentioned his mother, how she calls him every single week asking about grandchildren and making comments about his cousin who just had twins. His jaw got tight when he talked about her, and he said every conversation with her makes him feel like he's failing as a son because he can't give her what she wants. The therapist asked if he'd ever told his mother how her pressure affected him, and he shook his head fast. He explained that in his family you don't push back against your parents, you just take whatever they dish out and try to make them happy. I realized right then that I'd never actually understood how much his mother's expectations weighed on him, even though I'd been mad about it for months. The therapist turned to me and asked what I wanted to share, and suddenly my throat felt tight. I started talking about lying in that hospital bed with my stomach so swollen I could barely breathe, watching my husband click through fantasy football while nurses drained fluid from my belly. My voice cracked when I described how scared I was during the paracentesis procedure and how I kept looking at the door hoping he'd come find me, but he was downstairs arguing about parking fees instead. I told them both that I couldn't go through IVF again unless I actually trusted that he'd be there, not just physically present but actually engaged and supportive. The words came out faster as I kept talking, explaining how I'd felt so alone during the worst medical crisis of my life, and how that loneliness hurt worse than any of the physical pain. My husband's face went pale while I spoke, and he started to say something, but the therapist held up her hand gently. She let me finish completely before she responded, and when she did, her voice was calm and measured. She said what she was hearing from both of us was a communication breakdown that happened under enormous external pressure, not a fundamental lack of love or commitment. She pointed out that my husband shut down when he felt helpless, and I interpreted his shutdown as not caring, and meanwhile his mother's pressure made everything feel even more urgent and stressful. The reframe made sense in a way that surprised me, because I'd been so focused on being angry that I hadn't thought about the pattern underneath it all. The therapist pulled out a notebook and said she wanted to give us some homework before our next session. She explained that my husband needed to attend a partner education class at the fertility clinic within the next 2 weeks, one of those classes specifically designed to teach partners about IVF procedures and how to be supportive. My husband nodded and pulled out his phone right away to look up the class schedule, which was more initiative than I'd seen from him in months. The therapist also said we needed to do a daily 15-minute check-in, where we both talked about our feelings without trying to fix anything or defend ourselves. She was clear that the check-in wasn't about solving problems. It was just about sharing what was going on emotionally and listening to each other. It sounded simple when she described it, but I knew it wouldn't be easy for either of us because we'd spent years avoiding those kinds of conversations. My husband asked if 15 minutes was a minimum or maximum, and the therapist smiled slightly and said it was a target. But if we needed more time, that was fine as long as we were actually communicating and not just talking at each other. She scheduled our next appointment for 2 weeks out and said she expected us both to have completed the homework by then. The drive home was quiet, but not uncomfortable like before. And when we got inside, my husband immediately opened his laptop to register for the partner education class. He found one scheduled for the following Tuesday evening, and signed up without me having to remind him or push him to do it. That night, we tried our first 15-minute check-in, sitting across from each other at the kitchen table with the timer on his phone. I went first and told him I was scared that nothing would actually change, that he'd do the class and the check-ins but then fall back into old patterns once we started treatment again. He listened without interrupting, and when the timer went off, he admitted he was scared too, scared that he'd mess up again, and prove he couldn't be the partner I needed. We didn't solve anything during those 15 minutes, but something felt different about actually saying the fears out loud, instead of letting them fester silently. My husband went to the partner education class that Tuesday, and came home carrying a thick folder stuffed with handouts and information sheets. He set it on the kitchen table and actually started reading through it that same evening, highlighting sections and writing notes in the margins. I watched him from the couch and felt this weird mix of hope and suspicion, like I wanted to believe he was really trying, but I was also waiting for him to lose interest. He called me over after about an hour and started asking me questions about my experience during the first cycle, specific questions about how the medications made me feel and what the monitoring appointments were like. He wanted to know which shots hurt the most, and whether the bloating started right away or built up gradually. It was more engagement and genuine curiosity than he'd shown during the entire first IVF cycle, and I found myself answering his questions in detail, because it felt good to finally have him actually interested. We kept doing our daily check-ins, and during one of them about 5 days after the class, I told him about the moment in the hospital when Dr. House asked him what my estradiol level was. I described how scared and alone I felt when I realized my own husband didn't even know what estradiol was or why it mattered, despite being told about it dozens of times. My voice shook when I talked about it because that moment had crystallized everything wrong about our dynamic during treatment. He sat there listening, and when I finished, he was quiet for a long minute before responding. He finally said he'd been treating my medical care like something that was happening to me instead of something we were doing together. Like I was going through IVF and he was just a bystander who showed up sometimes. He said he saw now how wrong that was, and how it must have felt like I was completely on my own. His eyes got watery when he apologized, and I reached across the table to squeeze his hand, not because everything was fixed, but because I could see he was actually starting to understand. His mother called on a Saturday morning 2 weeks into our therapy homework, and my husband looked at his phone screen for a long moment before answering. He glanced at me and asked if it was okay to put her on speaker, and I nodded even though my stomach clenched with anxiety. He answered and immediately told her she was on speaker because I was right there with him. His mother launched into her usual questions about how the treatment was going, and when she could expect news, and my husband cut her off mid-sentence. He said clearly that we'd paused fertility treatment because of my health complications, and we wouldn't be discussing timelines or updates with family anymore. He explained that decisions about our medical care and family planning were between us and our doctors, period. The silence on the other end of the phone stretched out so long I thought maybe the call had dropped. His mother's voice came back sharp and hurt, saying she was just excited to be a grandmother and didn't understand why we were shutting her out. She brought up her age and how she might not be around forever to meet her grandchildren, and I watched my husband's face get red. She kept pushing, mentioning his cousin's twins again, and asking why we couldn't just give her some basic updates so she didn't have to worry. My husband's hand tightened around his phone, but his voice stayed steady when he responded. He told her he loved her, but this boundary wasn't up for negotiation, and if she couldn't respect our privacy about medical decisions, we'd need to limit contact for a while. His mother made a wounded noise and said she couldn't believe he was threatening to cut her off just for caring about her future grandchildren. He repeated that he loved her and wanted her in our lives, but only if she could accept that this topic was off limits. She hung up without saying goodbye. My husband set his phone down on the table and I saw that his hands were shaking badly. He pressed his palms flat against the wood like he was trying to steady himself, and I realized that standing up to his mother had taken everything he had. I reached over and squeezed his hand tight and told him I was really proud of him for setting that boundary. He looked at me with tears actually running down his face and said he was sorry for letting his mother's pressure override my health and our marriage for so long. He said he'd been so focused on trying to keep her happy that he'd completely failed to protect me or put our relationship first. I squeezed his hand harder and told him we were going to figure this out together, and for the first time in months, I actually believed it might be possible. We went back to the therapist 2 weeks later for our second session, and she asked us to report on our homework before we moved forward. My husband pulled out the folder from his education class and showed her his notes, explaining what he'd learned about the medications and procedures. I talked about our daily check-ins and how hard but helpful they'd been, especially the conversation about estradiol and feeling alone. The therapist looked genuinely pleased with our progress and said we'd done real work on our communication patterns. She pulled out a worksheet and explained that today we were going to create what she called if-then agreements, basically concrete commitments about what support would look like if we decided to try treatment again. She said these needed to be specific and measurable, not vague promises about being more present or trying harder. My husband grabbed a pen without being asked and pulled his chair closer to see the worksheet better. We spent the rest of the session working through different scenarios and writing down exactly what each of us would commit to doing. The therapist helped us draft agreements like if we do another IVF cycle, then my husband will take at least 3 days off work during the critical period around egg retrieval. She had us write down that if I need injections, then he'll either do them himself or arrange for someone qualified to help if he's not available. We added an agreement that if his mother asks questions about treatment, then he'll redirect her without sharing any details about our medical situation. The therapist made us be really specific about timing and actions, not just intentions. She asked questions like what counts as the critical period, and who would we call if my husband couldn't do an injection. Writing it all down on paper made everything feel more real and actually achievable, instead of just hopeful thinking. By the end of the session, we had a full page of if-then statements that covered most of the scenarios that had gone wrong during the first cycle. My husband folded the paper carefully and put it in his wallet, and the therapist scheduled our next appointment for 3 weeks out to give us time to practice the patterns we were building. 2 days after that therapy session, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize, and when I answered, a woman introduced herself as the scheduling person from the new fertility clinic. She explained that they had received my transfer paperwork from Dr. at House and wanted to set up a first meeting with both me and my husband. I started to say that getting my husband to come might be hard, but she cut me off gently and said their policy actually requires both partners at every appointment for high-risk cases like mine. Something about hearing that it was built into their system instead of something I'd have to beg for made my chest feel lighter. I scheduled us for 3 weeks out and she reminded me twice to make sure my husband had it in his calendar, which told me they'd seen plenty of absent partners before. The next morning, I met Maggie at a coffee shop halfway between our houses, and seeing her in person after weeks of messaging felt like hugging an old friend. She looked healthy and glowing, and when she told me she was 12 weeks pregnant from a frozen embryo transfer, I actually teared up right there at the table. She reached across and squeezed my hand and said she knew I'd get there too. And for the first time in months, I let myself believe it might actually happen. We talked for over an hour about everything from medication side effects to dealing with family pressure, and she gave me the name of the support group that had helped her the most. Walking back to my car, I realized how much I'd needed to talk to someone who really understood what this whole process does to you. That afternoon, my husband suggested we try walking around the block together, and I agreed even though I wasn't sure I could make it the whole way. We made it about halfway before I had to stop and catch my breath, but my stomach didn't hurt and I didn't feel like I might pass out. My husband waited patiently while I rested against a fence, and then we talked about whether we were actually ready to try treatment again. He admitted he was scared of me getting that sick again, and I told him I was scared too, but also scared of giving up on having kids. We both agreed we needed at least another month of therapy and real preparation before making any decisions. At our third therapy session the following week, the therapist had us talk about the fear and anger that had built up during the first IVF cycle. She asked me to describe specific moments when I felt most alone, and I brought up the paracentesis procedure and the injection classes my husband skipped. My husband's face got red, but he didn't get defensive, and when the therapist asked him to explain what he was feeling during those times, he said he'd been shutting down because he felt helpless and didn't know how to fix anything. The therapist helped us figure out warning signs that we were falling back into old patterns, like him spending too much time on his phone or me not speaking up when I needed help. She had us practice calling out those patterns gently in the session, saying things without blame or anger. By the end, I felt like we had actual tools instead of just good intentions. 3 days later, my husband came home from work looking excited and showed me an email on his phone. His HR department had approved his request for partial leave during a future IVF cycle, which meant he could work from home during the critical days and take full days off if needed. He'd filled out all the paperwork himself without me having to remind him, and I could see he was proud of planning ahead this time. The approval removed one of the big worries I'd had about trying again. I had my final follow-up appointment with Dr. House the next week, and he did a full exam and checked my blood work. Everything had returned to normal ranges, and my stomach was completely back to its regular size. He sat back in his chair and told me he was really glad to see I was taking time to build up my support system before jumping back into treatment. I thanked him for everything he'd done, especially for speaking up when my husband wasn't supporting me right. He said he'd sent all my records to the new doctor with detailed notes, and he hoped everything worked out for us. Walking out of his office felt like closing one chapter, and I was grateful but also ready for a fresh start. That same afternoon, I got an email from the social worker who'd helped us at the hospital. She was checking in to see how things were going, and I wrote back right away telling her about the home health visits and the therapy sessions. I explained that her referrals had made a real difference in how we were handling everything. She replied within an hour saying she was happy to hear we were doing better and to reach out if we needed anything else. Reading her message reminded me that there were people who actually cared about what happened to me beyond just the medical stuff. The consultation appointment with the new fertility doctor finally arrived, and my husband met me in the parking lot with the folder from his education class under his arm. Walking into the office together, I noticed he'd also brought a list of questions he'd written down the night before. The new doctor was a woman in her 50s with a calm way of talking, and she spent the first 20 minutes just listening to our story. When my husband pulled out his folder and started referencing his notes, she looked genuinely impressed and said it was clear he'd been doing his homework. She went through each of his questions carefully, explaining the risks and what they'd do differently to prevent another OHSS situation. About halfway through the appointment, she turned to my husband and asked him to explain what OHSS actually is and what warning signs to watch for. I held my breath because this felt like a test of whether all his education had stuck. He answered correctly, naming the symptoms like rapid weight gain and trouble breathing, and he even mentioned the estradiol levels and why they matter. The doctor nodded and said that was exactly right, and I felt this huge wave of relief wash over me. After we'd covered all the medical details, the doctor asked when we wanted to start a new cycle. My husband and I looked at each other and I said we were thinking at least one more month to keep working on our communication and preparation. The doctor smiled and said that was actually a really smart choice. She explained that taking time to prepare mentally and practically usually leads to better outcomes, and there was no rush that was worth putting my health or our relationship at risk. She scheduled us for another appointment in 6 weeks to check in and make a final decision together. Driving home, my husband reached over and took my hand, and neither of us said anything, but we didn't need to. That evening, my husband's phone buzzed while we were making dinner, and he glanced at it, then handed it to me without a word. The text from his mother said she was sorry for pushing too hard about grandchildren, and she wanted to drop off some homemade soup and a care package if we were comfortable with that. She added that there were no expectations, and she just wanted to show support. My husband watched my face while I read it, and then asked if I was okay with her stopping by for a few minutes. The fact that he was checking with me first instead of just telling me she was coming felt like real progress. I said a short visit would be fine, and he texted her back right away to set it up for the next afternoon. When his mother arrived the following day, she kept the conversation focused on neutral topics like her garden and a book she was reading. She brought a container of chicken soup that was still warm and a card that just said "thinking of you" in simple handwriting. We sat at the kitchen table for maybe 20 minutes, and she never once mentioned grandchildren or timelines or asked when we might try treatment again. She asked how I was feeling physically and listened when I talked about my recovery without offering advice or opinions. When she left, she hugged me gently and told my husband she was proud of how he was showing up for me. Things weren't perfect between us, but it felt like she was actually trying to respect the boundaries we'd set. At our 4th therapy session the next week, the therapist had us review all the changes we'd made over the past month. She pulled out her notes from our first session and read back some of what we'd said then, and hearing it out loud made me realize how far we'd actually come. My husband had completed the education class, learned the medication names, practiced giving injections, and started checking in with me daily about how I was feeling. The therapist said we'd done genuine work on our communication patterns, and she was optimistic about our ability to handle future challenges as a team. She helped us create a maintenance plan for keeping up the progress, including weekly check-ins and strategies for when old patterns started creeping back. Walking out of that session, I felt something I hadn't felt in months, which was actual hope that we could do this together. The next morning, I came downstairs to find my husband at the refrigerator with a marker and a printed schedule. He'd created a detailed checklist for the next IVF cycle with sections for medication times, appointment dates, meal planning, household tasks, and daily emotional check-ins. He explained that he wanted everything written out, so nothing would fall through the cracks this time. Seeing it all laid out in his handwriting made the whole process feel manageable instead of overwhelming. I realized we were actually working as a team now, instead of me carrying everything alone while he stayed on the sidelines. One quiet evening about a week later, we sat together on the couch with tea and no distractions. His laptop stayed closed on the desk, and both our phones were in the other room. My husband took my hand and looked right at me when he said he knew the last cycle was terrible, and he was committed to making sure the next one was completely different. He said he understood now that I needed him to be present and involved, not just physically there, but actually paying attention and helping. I believed him this time because I'd watched him show up consistently for weeks now, doing the work without me having to ask or remind him. I was still nervous about trying again because the OHSS had been so scary and painful, but sitting there with his hand in mine and seeing the checklist on our refrigerator and remembering how he'd stood up to his mother, I finally felt like I wasn't facing this alone anymore. And that's today's wrap-up. I try to keep these stories simple, but with a point you can actually use. Hopefully this one stuck with you. Subscribe if you'd like to keep learning through them.